guys, tonight we're taking a journey way back to the golden age of Spanish bureaucracy, which just so happened to overlap with one of history's most chilling examples of institutional power, the Spanish Inquisition. Now I know what you're thinking: torture, big hats, Monty Python sketches. But we're going to peel back the layers and look at the slow, terrifying, and deeply boring administrative process that you, a citizen in late 15th century Spain, would actually have gone through. It's less spectacle and more suffocating legal process, which ironically makes it even scarier. Imagine this. It's the middle of the night. The year is 1490. You're asleep in your simple, dark home in Seville, maybe dreaming of olives and orange blossoms, or perhaps just dreading the next day's work. The city is silent, save for the occasional dog bark or the distant rhythmic clang of a blacksmith who clearly didn't get the memo about regular business hours. Suddenly, there's a deliberate heavy knock at the outer door, not a frantic rap, but a calm, authoritative pounding that sounds less like a request and more like an announcement of inevitable doom. You bolt upright, your heart immediately leaping into your throat. It's the kind of sound that doesn't just wake you up, it rewires your entire nervous system. You probably already know what this means. Rumors travel faster than a royal decree, and the whispers about the holy office of the Inquisition have been circulating for years. They are here for someone, and judging by the lateness of the hour, that someone is almost certainly a person who has fallen under suspicion of being an insincere convert. Maybe you're a Converso, a person of Jewish heritage who accepted baptism to remain in Spain, or perhaps a Morisco of Muslim descent, now a Christian. The key is that the Inquisition wasn't generally interested in Jews or Muslims who had never converted. Those groups were subject to other royal laws, including eventual expulsion. No, the Inquisition's target was heresy among the baptized. It was designed to ferret out those who, despite their Christian names and attendance at Mass, were still performing subtle rituals in the privacy of their homes, maybe lighting candles on a Friday night, refusing to eat pork, or changing their clothes after using the bath. Just the thought of it is enough to make the air feel thick and heavy. You pad quietly to the window, pulling the heavy curtain, just a fraction. Down in the narrow street, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a few oil lamps, stand two men. They are severe figures, usually. Dominican friars, often accompanied by a lay official called the familiar, a kind of glorified police officer of the Holy Office. They are dressed simply, but their presence radiates an authority that outranks King Ferdinand himself. They don't have shining armor or dramatic costumes. They have the quiet, absolute power of God and crown combined. You know that resisting is not an option. It would only make things much, much worse for you and your family. The door creaks open. The scene is quick, cold, and professional. You are told in hushed but firm tones that you are being detained on suspicion of offenses against the faith. You are not told who accused you, nor are you given a chance to argue your innocence right then and there. This is a common historical fact. The Inquisition's procedures deliberately prevented the accused from confronting their accusers, citing fear of retaliation as the reason. A quirky tidbit, however, is that while they wouldn't tell you the names, they often made you guess, which was a brilliant, if terrifying, psychological technique to get you to incriminate people you disliked or feared. It was a paranoid nightmare wrapped in a legal package. You are allowed to dress, but everything you own is now essentially frozen. You will be escorted out immediately. You might catch a glimpse of your spouse or children, their faces pale and eyes wide with silent horror. You can't comfort them, you can't explain anything, and you certainly can't tell them where you are going. You are simply escorted out into the cool night air. The walk to the prison is short, but feels like a lifetime. Each step you take away from your home is a step closer to a dark, cold silence. The guards don't speak, you don't speak, and the only sound is the shuffling of your simple shoes on the cobblestones. You are now officially in the system. Your old life is over, and your new one, which you probably won't survive in its current form, is just beginning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me what time it is, where you are, and where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these boring bedtime stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at a building that doesn't look like a standard city jail. It is often a former palace, a large house, or sometimes a converted monastery, but it has the unmistakable, heavy air of institutional power. Inside, you are handed over to the warden, the alcalde. The first step, the one that truly seals your fate, is the inventory. Everything you have on you is meticulously recorded: the coins in your purse, the silver buttons on your jacket, the worn leather of your shoes. This is not for safekeeping, mind you. This inventory is the beginning of the end of your financial life, as your property will soon be seized to pay for the costs of your own detention trial, and if you're eventually reconciled, your penance. This is where the institution's chilling efficiency truly hits home. The Inquisition was designed to be financially self-sustaining, a detail that many historians still argue whether it was the primary motivation for the institution's existence, or simply a beneficial side effect of its quest for spiritual purity. Whatever the case, you are literally paying for the process that might destroy you. You are stripped of your outer garments, given rough, coarse clothes, and led deep into the bowels of the jail. You are now in the secret prison, a world away from the familiar sights and sounds of your life. They haven't put you in the city's common jail, that chaotic, noisy mess. No, the Inquisition's prisons were designed for a different kind of punishment: isolation. This is where the psychological game begins, long before any physical discomfort is applied. The cells are single-occupancy small, and often deliberately placed where you cannot see or speak to any other prisoner. You are, for all intents and purposes, utterly alone. The goal here isn't to punish you yet. It's to soften you up, to make you compliant, and most importantly, to encourage you to confess. Imagine the cell. It's stone cold, maybe damp, with only a thin straw pallet on the floor. Light is minimal, perhaps a tiny barred window high up near the ceiling, or sometimes none at all. The silence is profound, the kind of silence that starts to feel aggressive, like a weight pressing down on your ears. You don't hear the clamor of the outside world, you don't hear the comforting voices of your family. All you hear is the echo of your own thoughts, which after a few days become your worst enemy. This period of solitary confinement, which could last for weeks or even months, is a crucial historical fact of the Inquisition's process. The isolation was intentionally used to break the prisoner's resolve, leveraging fear and uncertainty to generate a confession. You are denied any communication with the outside world, including your family. You are completely in the dark about the charges against you. You just know you're a heretic, a sinner against the holy faith. And that's a heavy burden to carry alone in the dark. You start running through your memories, trying to figure out what you might have done, or more likely, what seemingly innocent action someone might have misunderstood and reported. Did you wash your hands too thoroughly before dinner? Did you put on a clean shirt on a Saturday? These seemingly benign daily habits of your past faith are now the ghosts haunting your cell. Your meals are sparse bread and water, maybe a thin gruel delivered by a silent guard. This is not starvation, but it is certainly designed to keep you physically weak and mentally foggy. You'll be longing for the taste of that rich, smoky Spanish ham, which, by the way, if you were a converso, you probably wouldn't have eaten in your old life, and now you're definitely not eating it in this one. It's a dark, dreary loop of eating, sitting, and worrying. This isolation was sometimes alleviated by an oddly quirky tidbit. The Inquisition had its own doctors. Their role, as strange as it sounds, was to monitor your health. Not because they were worried about your long-term well-being, of course, but because they needed to ensure you were fit enough to endure the rest of the judicial process, including the potential for torture. They wanted a functioning, lucid body for interrogation, not a dead one. If you seemed genuinely ill, or ironically, if you were suspected of feigning illness, the doctor would be brought in. It's a chilling detail, the care taken, to ensure you were healthy enough for them to inflict controlled suffering. As the days turn into weeks, the line between reality and the echoing walls starts to blur. You might occasionally hear faint noises from the adjacent cells, a cough, a sigh, a soft scraping sound. These noises are deeply unsettling because they remind you that you are not the only one here, yet you are forbidden from interacting. The guards, when they appear, enforce silence with absolute rigor. You may have heard of the infamous Iron Maiden, or the Head Crusher, often associated with the general over-the-top cruelty of the Middle Ages. But historians still argue whether the Spanish Inquisition actually used many of the more theatrical, purely sadistic torture devices later attributed to it, or if those myths were largely propagated by rival Protestant nations to create what was known as the Black Legend of Spanish brutality. It is generally agreed that the Inquisition preferred specific three-part methods which were methodical, documented, and psychologically calibrated. They weren't interested in random carnage. They were interested in a confession sealed and signed. But for now, there is no rack, no pulley, no fire. There is only the silence, the cold and the relentless pressure of your own conscience. This is the first audience phase. You are brought before the tribunal, a group of gray men usually, just the inquisitor, the prosecutor, and the secretary. They ask you to tell the truth, to relieve your conscience, to confess your sins against the faith. They speak gently, almost kindly, telling you that repentance is the path to mercy. But they still don't tell you the charges. You're being asked to confess to a crime whose nature, severity, and date you don't even know. It's a perfect trap. Confess to something small, and you've confirmed their suspicions. Confess to nothing, and you prove your hard-heartedness, your refusal to cooperate with the Holy Office. Either way, you are one step closer to the next phase, the phase where the Holy Office decides it's time to shake a little cooperation out of you using the collective paranoia of your community. The isolation is relentless, but eventually the guards come for you again. You are brought back to the tribunal, perhaps weeks or even months after that first confusing interview. The inquisitor, with his heavy robes and heavier gaze, still speaks of mercy, but now the context has shifted. They want you to understand the system, the terrifying, well-oiled machine that brought you here. You are informed about the Edict of Grace. While you were alone in your cell, the Inquisition was busy in your town. They would arrive and announce a period typically 30 to 40 days during which anyone could voluntarily come forward and confess to acts of heresy, and in doing so receive a lighter penance. This was a psychological masterstroke designed to turn the community in on itself. The promise of leniency acted as a pressure cooker, encouraging conversos and Moriscos to admit to their small, secret practices, hoping to avoid a formal trial. But here's the twist. The truly insidious part that relates directly to your imprisonment. The confessions made during the Edict of Grace were not enough to secure true freedom. While the penitents received absolution and avoided immediate execution, they were required to denounce everyone they knew who might also be practicing forbidden rituals. This is the historical fact that cemented the Inquisition's power. The Edict of Grace successfully weaponized paranoia, creating a vast network of informants who willingly provided names to the Holy Office in exchange for their own clemency. Imagine the weight of that choice. To save yourself, you are forced to point the finger at your cousins, your neighbors, or even your business partner. And because the details of heretical practice were often small, like changing bed linens on a Friday or using clean tablecloths, people would report others for the vaguest of suspicions. This created a paper trail of accusations that the inquisitors sitting in their tribunals would now be examining. The quirky tidbit here is that people would sometimes confess to the most bizarre or trivial things to look sincere. There are records of penitents admitting they had failed to attend Mass on a particular saint's day, or that they had worn a nice silk shirt too many times. They were trying to throw the Inquisition off the scent of more serious matters, but in doing so, they provided a wealth of circumstantial evidence about social habits and networks that the Inquisition eagerly absorbed. So when you are brought back before the tribunal, they are no longer just guessing. They have a stack of depositions, including the names of those who have confessed, and crucially, the names they have denounced. The Inquisitor asks you again, are you now ready to confess and unburden your soul? If you maintain your innocence, you are now showing a dangerous level of recalcitrance, because they know from the whispers of your neighbors that something's probably going on. The inquisitors will start reading excerpts from the depositions, carefully omitting the names of the witnesses. They might say in a calm, flat tone, "A witness reports that you, after childbirth, changed your linen too soon contrary to Christian custom, or a neighbor observed that you do not buy meat from the public market, which suggests you follow the dietary restrictions of the old law." They watch your face for a flicker of recognition, a twitch of guilt. You realize with a sickening lurch that the case against you is built entirely on these vague second-hand observations. But how do you defend yourself against the knowledge that someone you trusted has likely betrayed you? Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the denunciation clauses in the Edict of Grace was truly spiritual, to cleanse the community of sin, or whether it was a deliberate, cynical tool of social control. The result, regardless of intent, was a society governed by suspicion, where every closed door and every subtle daily habit could be misconstrued and reported to the authorities. You are being asked to step into a hall of mirrors. If you name your accusers, you can offer a proper defense, maybe show they have an old family feud with you. But the Inquisition refuses to give up those names. If you guess your accusers, and you guess wrong, you only confirm your own deceit. Your only path out, they suggest, is to confess to the core offense and name those who led you astray. But you know that confessing now without the protection of the Edict of Grace will lead to a much harsher sentence. This bureaucratic dance of death has only just begun. You have refused to incriminate yourself, and soon the tribunal will feel it has exhausted the path of charitable warning, and it will be time to move to the next much less comfortable phase of the interrogation. After refusing to take the bait during the softer stages of interrogation, the isolation, the vague warnings, the pressure to confess a crime you haven't been officially told you committed, you are now facing the formal heart of the system, the tribunal. This is where the Inquisition sheds its pretense of being solely a confessional booth and fully embraces its role as a judicial body. albeit one with rules that would make any modern lawyer choke on their latte. You are led into the audience chamber, which, despite the gravity of the proceedings, is often surprisingly simple. It's not some grand, spooky hall filled with skulls and cobwebs. It's usually a functional room, dark wood, heavy tables, and the presence of the three key figures, the inquisitor, or several of them, the prosecutor, the fiscal, and most importantly for the historical record, the secretary, the notary. These men are your entire world now, and they look nothing like the cartoonish villains of later folklore. They are learned men, usually in Dominican habits, cold, methodical, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The inquisitor presides the ultimate judge of your soul. The prosecutor lays out the case against you, though still without revealing the witnesses' names. And the secretary sits with his quill meticulously recording every single word spoken. This constant, detailed record-keeping is a mainstream historical fact of the Spanish Inquisition. The tribunal was obsessed with documentation, producing volumes of detailed trial records that are now an invaluable, if chilling, source for historians. Everything you say, every gasp, every denial is noted down. But the most frustrating and terrifying aspect of this stage is your lack of defense. You are formally denied the right to counsel, or, if an attorney is appointed, that lawyer is often a member of the Inquisition's own staff, sworn to uphold the interests of the Holy Office above your own. Their primary duty is to urge you to confess. Imagine that your defense lawyer is essentially another prosecutor. You are, however, given the chance to draw up a list of your enemies. This is a bizarre quirk of the system. You are asked to name anyone who might harbor resentment against you, such as people you've had financial disputes with, neighbors you've insulted, or rivals in love. The tribunal would then cross-reference this list with their anonymous witness list. If an accuser was on your list of known enemies, their testimony was supposed to be disregarded, or at least treated with extreme suspicion. This sounds like a fair judicial protection, but here's the quirky tidbit that renders it almost useless. Because the witnesses were anonymous, you were essentially guessing blind. You might name 50 people, but if your actual accuser wasn't on that list, their testimony stood. Moreover, if you missed a legitimate enemy, their testimony could be the very thing that sinks you. It's a game you are designed to lose, built on the premise that any resistance or denial is evidence of your guilt. The charges read out against you are often vague, focused not on concrete actions, but on patterns of behavior that suggest insincerity. They might accuse you of Judaizing or Moriscan practices. The goal isn't to prove you sinned, but that you sinned knowingly against the Christian faith after baptism. This is where the money comes in again. Remember when we talked about your property being seized? At this stage, you are technically required to pay for the cost of your imprisonment and trial. The longer the process drags on, and they can drag on for years, the more of your seized assets are depleted. The financial incentive for the Crown and the Inquisitors is a grim reality. Historians still argue whether the financial self-sufficiency of the tribunals was the main driver of the persecution, or if the pursuit of religious uniformity truly held precedence over the confiscation of wealth. Regardless, you, the defendant, are watching your life savings trickle away to fund the very process that is ruining you. You protest your innocence. You swear on the cross. You declare your absolute and fervent Catholicism. The prosecutor presents the evidence, the neighbor's observation of your too clean shirt, the servant's vague memory of you muttering a prayer in an unfamiliar tongue, the relative who, under the Edict of Grace, named you as someone who avoided pork. The secretary writes it all down, Every denial you make is simply recorded as a failure to unburden your soul, a further indication of your stubborn refusal to accept the mercy of the Holy Office. The longer you deny, the more half-proofs they amass, and the closer you get to the chilling phrase that marks the end of the polite phase, the order for the Monitio Caritativa. The charitable warning, the final step, before the darkness of the torture chamber, as you sit before the tribunal, refusing to confess the true nature of your alleged crime, becomes clear it is one of ancestry, not just action. While the Inquisition officially targets all heresy, its creation and primary focus in the late 15th and 16th centuries was on conversos and later Moriscos, you are one of them. You or your recent ancestors accepted baptism, trading your former faith, Judaism or Islam, for the Catholic faith, often under immense political or social pressure, or due to the Alhambra Decree of 1492, which expelled Jews who refused to convert. Now you're trapped in a terrible catch-22. You're only being persecuted because you converted for the sin of potential insincerity. The fear for the Holy Office wasn't just about theology. It was about the supposed threat these groups posed to the unified Christian kingdom that Ferdinand and Isabella were painstakingly building. They feared that beneath the veneer of Christian baptism, ancient customs and beliefs persisted, polluting the spiritual purity of Spain. They were looking for crypto-Judaism or crypto-Islam, the secret practice of old rites like the forbidden observance of the Sabbath, the keeping of fasts, or the refusal to consume pork conversos. For Moriscos, it might be the ritual bathing the maintenance of certain garments or using specific methods of slaughtering animals. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Spanish Inquisition was fundamentally established to police the sincerity of new converts known as Section 7. You are now facing the culmination of the tribunal's work, a massive, meticulously documented file of circumstantial proof against you. But before the physical pain begins, there is a financial hammer blow that has already crushed your family, the sequestration of goods. The moment you were arrested and escorted from your home in Section 1, your entire estate was put under the control of the Holy Office. This is the grim mainstream historical fact. Upon arrest, the Inquisition immediately sequestered all of the accused's property, including land money and movable goods, often without recourse, regardless of the eventual verdict. This was justified as a necessity to cover the expenses of your long imprisonment, the costs of your trial, and the maintenance of your family if they were indigent. Imagine the horror of your family outside the prison walls. They are now destitute. They cannot access the funds to pay their rent or buy food. If your wife or children petition the Holy Office for maintenance, they might receive a tiny stipend, often just enough to stave off actual starvation. And this small allowance is also drawn from your own sequestered property. Every bite they eat, every night they spend under a roof is paid for by your vanishing assets. The true chilling detail here is the conflict of interest this arrangement created. The longer your trial lasted, the more thorough the investigation, and the more your property was consumed by the administrative costs. If you were eventually found guilty and reconciled, the remainder of your property was permanently confiscated by the Crown and the Inquisition. If you were found innocent, your property was supposed to be returned, but after years of sequestration, accounting errors and high administrative fees, you often received back only a fraction of what you started with. This system was designed to make the Inquisition self-funding, incredibly efficient, and highly profitable. Here's a quirky tidbit. The detailed records of the Inquisition often include meticulous lists of the household items confiscated from the accused. In a way, these documents offer a strange glimpse into the daily life of a 15th century middle-class home, from silver spoons to silk vestments to old account books, all itemized, valued, and then sold off to fund the organization that ruined the original owner. You are quite literally paying for your own persecution. You sitting before the tribunal are now acutely aware of this devastating financial reality. Your obstinacy, your denial of guilt, is not just imperiling your soul, it's condemning your family to penury. The inquisitors know this. They frequently remind you that only a full, truthful confession can perhaps expedite the process, limiting the per se cost of the trial. Historians still argue whether the financial motivation was the primary engine driving the Spanish Inquisition, especially given the Crown's desperate need for funds following the Reconquista and the cost of the wars. Some revisionist scholars emphasize the genuine spiritual goal of achieving religious uniformity, while others point to the massive wealth transfer from the Conversos to the Crown and the Church as undeniable proof of financial opportunism. For you, the accused, that debate is academic. You only feel the terrifying reality of being stripped bare financially, socially, and soon physically. This systematic impoverishment served a dual purpose. It funded the Inquisition, and it ensured that even if you somehow escaped the ultimate punishment, you would be left completely ruined, unable to reestablish your social or economic standing. You would be a permanent pariah, having paid the ultimate price for your trial. The tribunal, having confirmed your refusal to confess freely, and your evident financial and social destruction, now moves to the final necessary formality before the extreme methods begin. They must present it as an act of grace. You've been through the initial shock, the isolation, the enemy naming game, and the tribunal has its stacks of anonymous depositions. Now let's look closer at those piles of parchment, the evidence that has condemned you. The Inquisition was relentless in gathering the evidence, relying almost entirely on a system built on whispers and neighborly suspicion. They called it prueba plena, full proof. But what they accepted as proof was anything but robust. The mainstream historical fact is that the Inquisition based its initial prosecutions largely on the aggregated testimony of two or more independent witnesses, even if that testimony consisted only of circumstantial observations of daily life. They weren't looking for a smoking gun. They were looking for patterns. The inquisitors were masters of constructing a compelling narrative from tiny, unrelated fragments. Imagine the prosecutor reading the record. He has testimony from a servant, a disgruntled neighbor, and maybe a family member who confessed under the Edict of Grace. None of them saw you explicitly renounce Christ or perform a grand act of heresy. Instead, their testimonies create a mosaic of suspicion. The accused washed her floors and changed her clothes on Friday afternoons. This suggests preparation for the Jewish Sabbath. The accused did not appear to eat pork, claiming poor health, and was observed removing fat from meat before cooking. This points toward adherence to Jewish or Muslim dietary laws. The accused turned his face to the wall when a cross was raised or when he prayed. This could suggest praying in a forbidden direction like Mecca or avoiding the Christian symbols. These are what we call whisper networks, a constant, low-grade social surveillance system that the Inquisition successfully institutionalized. It meant that your entire community became a potential tribunal. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the more peculiar pieces of evidence recorded in some trials involved the preparation of poultry. If you prepared a chicken by cutting the throat and draining the blood, a perfectly normal method of slaughter, yet also a requirement of kashrut Jewish dietary law, or dabiha, Islamic slaughter, it could be cited as damning proof of continued adherence to the old law. In some records, even the refusal to offer visitors wine or the use of certain medicinal herbal remedies were interpreted as signs of secret, non-Christian practices. In order to appear fully Christian, you had to perform public displays that actively contradicted your cultural history, like eating pork fat off a knife in the street. Okay, maybe not that far, but you get the idea. This process meant that innocent cultural habits became crimes. Perhaps your grandmother simply taught you an old cleaning routine that predated the conversion, or perhaps you just genuinely disliked bacon. The Inquisition didn't care about your benign intent. They cared about the objective interpretation of your actions through the lens of heresy. Your denial only hardened their resolve, suggesting that the old law was so deeply ingrained that you performed its rituals without even realizing it, thus making your conversion inherently fraudulent. The secretary observing your denial records your pertinacia, your obstinacy. Your continued insistence on innocence is not seen as a defense. It's seen as proof that the devil has hardened your heart, preventing you from seeing your own sin and accepting the Holy Office's mercy. Historians still argue whether the inquisitors genuinely believed every single accusation they recorded, or if the system became so rigid and self-perpetuating, fueled by the financial benefit of confiscation, which we'll get to in the next section, that the search for truth became secondary to the process of conviction. It's hard to know where sincere zeal ended and institutional momentum began, but for you sitting there, it doesn't matter. The meticulous records of your mundane life are now stacked against you, and you realize that even if you could prove every single witness was a liar, the sheer volume of these circumstantial half-proofs has already convicted you in the minds of the tribunal. They have reached a point of semi-plena probatio, half-full proof, which in the twisted logic of the era's law was just enough justification to warrant the next step, the attempt to extract the full truth by force. You are now facing the culmination of the tribunal's work, a massive, meticulously documented file of circumstantial proof against you. But before the physical pain begins, there is a financial hammer blow that has already crushed your family, the sequestration of goods. The moment you were arrested and escorted from your home in Section 1, your entire estate was put under the control of the Holy Office. This is the grim mainstream historical fact. Upon arrest, the Inquisition immediately sequestered all of the accused's property, including land money and movable goods, often without recourse, regardless of the eventual verdict. This was justified as a necessity to cover the expenses of your long imprisonment, the costs of your trial, and the maintenance of your family if they were indigent. Imagine the horror of your family outside the prison walls. They are now destitute. They cannot access the funds to pay their rent or buy food. If your wife or children petition the Holy Office for maintenance, they might receive a tiny stipend, often just enough to stave off actual starvation, and the small allowance is also drawn from your own sequestered property. Every bite they eat, every night they spend under a roof is paid for by your vanishing assets. The true chilling detail here is the conflict of interest this arrangement created. The longer your trial lasted, the more thorough the investigation, and the more your property was consumed by the administrative costs. If you were eventually found guilty and reconciled, the remainder of your property was permanently confiscated by the Crown and the Inquisition. If you were found innocent, your property was supposed to be returned, but after years of sequestration, accounting errors, and high administrative fees, you often received back only a fraction of what you started with. This system was designed to make the Inquisition self-funding, incredibly efficient, and highly profitable. Here's a quirky tidbit. The detailed records of the Inquisition often include meticulous lists of the household items confiscated from the accused. In a way, these documents offer a strange glimpse into the daily life of a 15th century middle-class home, from silver spoons to silk vestments to old account books, all itemized, valued, and then sold off to fund the organization that ruined the original owner. You are quite literally paying for your own persecution. You sitting before the tribunal are now acutely aware of this devastating financial reality. Your obstinacy, your denial of guilt, is not just imperiling your soul, it's condemning your family to penury. The inquisitors know this. They frequently remind you that only a full, truthful confession can perhaps expedite the process, limiting the per se cost of the trial. Historians still argue whether the financial motivation was the primary engine driving the Spanish Inquisition, especially given the Crown's desperate need for funds following the Reconquista and the cost of the wars. Some revisionist scholars emphasize the genuine, spiritual goal of achieving religious uniformity, while others point to the massive wealth transfer from the Conversos to the Crown and the Church as undeniable proof of financial opportunism. For you, the accused, that debate is academic. You only feel the terrifying reality of being stripped bare financially, socially, and soon physically. This systematic impoverishment served a dual purpose. It funded the Inquisition, and it ensured that even if you somehow escaped the ultimate punishment, you would be left completely ruined, unable to reestablish your social or economic standing. You would be a permanent pariah, having paid the ultimate price for your trial. The tribunal, having confirmed your refusal to confess freely and your evident financial and social destruction, now moves to the final necessary formality before the extreme methods begin. They must present it as an act of grace. You have withstood the isolation, the anonymous accusations, and the tribunal's cool, relentless pressure. Your denial stands stubbornly in the face of all their circumstantial evidence. This means you are now considered negativo-negative, uncooperative, and a major threat to the purity of your own soul. The tribunal believes they have sufficient evidence to believe you are lying, but they lack the crucial element, your own confession, freely given and recorded. At this point, the inquisitor assumes a posture of profound, almost theatrical sadness. He must, for the record, offer you one last chance at saving yourself through kindness. This is the moment for the Monitio Caritativa, the charitable warning. The mainstream historical fact is that the Monitio Caritativa was the final formal spiritual warning issued by the Inquisition before resorting to judicial torture, framed as an act of mercy to compel the accused to save their soul. It was not a genuine invitation to debate. It was the last administrative hurdle before the physical interrogation. The inquisitor will solemnly explain that the tribunal, after reviewing the overwhelming evidence, which you know to be hearsay and rumor, has no choice but to conclude you are guilty of the offenses charged. He expresses sorrow that your soul is now in grave danger. He then appeals to you gently to think of your eternal salvation. He will explain that the Holy Office must have the truth, and if you continue to deny it, they will be forced to employ the necessary means to extract that truth, not as a punishment, but as a final, dreadful act of charity, to free your soul from the sin of obstinate heresy. The logic is chillingly circular. They torture you for your own good. The atmosphere is heavy with this false piety. You are now fully aware that the next room is the torture chamber. This knowledge itself is the first stage of the torture. The psychological pressure that you have been under since the moment of your arrest now reaches its apex. You are facing the inevitable, and they want you to confess out of fear right now to save them the paperwork of the next stage. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Monitio Caritativa would often be repeated several times over a few days, punctuated by periods back in your isolated cell. The inquisitors didn't want a confession extracted solely under duress of physical pain. They wanted a confession that could appear voluntary. So they'd issue the warning, let you stew in your cold, dark fear for 24 hours, and then bring you back to see if the dread had broken your will. This administrative pause was designed to make your eventual confession look like a reasoned decision. When you refuse this last warning, standing firm in your innocence, you are showing an almost supernatural level of obstinacy. The inquisitor then issues the formal decree. Since you refuse to speak the truth voluntarily, the court orders you to be taken to the Camera de Tormento, the torture chamber, and subjected to the necessary procedures. The order is given not as a punishment. They are very clear on this distinction, but ad extorquendum, veritatem, to extract the truth. Historians still argue whether this theatrical show of charity was sincere on the part of the inquisitors, or if it was merely a cynical legal mechanism designed to adhere to canon law, which generally frowned upon the use of torture without due process. In the end, the distinction doesn't matter much to the accused. All that matters is the word of the inquisitor delivered in that sleepy ASMR cadence that your moment of grace has passed. A guard and the verdugo, the executioner or torturer, a silent figure, often hooded or masked, step forward. The executioner is usually cloaked not out of secrecy, but to emphasize his role as a functionary, a faceless instrument of the law performing a necessary but distasteful duty. You are now led away from the functional tribunal room and down into the lower levels of the building toward a place of stone iron and unimaginable dread. You are now in the Camera de Tormento, the torture chamber. This room, deep underground or in a remote section of the building, is not the pit of fire and iron you might have imagined from crude woodcuts. It is a chamber of stark efficiency designed not to maim or execute, but to inflict pain precisely and controllably, all while adhering to a paradoxical set of bureaucratic rules. The scene is dominated by the instruments. The rack, the water cure, implements the pulley. But it is the people who matter most. You are stripped of your outer garments and secured. Present are the inquisitors who must personally witness the procedure. The secretary who sits ready to record every syllable, spoken every groan and every order given, and the alguacil or bailiff who supervises the verdugo, the executioner. The presence of the secretary, quill poised, is the chilling historical fact. The Inquisition required meticulous recording of the entire torture session, including the precise time, the methods used, the questions asked, and the prisoners' exact responses down to their cries of pain. This is where the official rules clash with the brutal reality. The inquisitors were legally bound by strict internal guidelines. Torture could not be repeated. They could, however, call you back for a continuation or dilatation, delay, of the same session on a later day, which amounted to the same thing. Torture could not cause permanent injury or effusion of blood, bleeding. This rule was often a fig leaf, as the methods employed routinely caused dislocated joints or internal injuries, which the inquisitors would simply record as self-inflicted injuries due to the prisoner's stubbornness. The inquisitor must be present. This was to ensure the procedures stayed within the legal limits, a twisted comfort, I know. Here's a quirky tidbit about the bureaucracy before the torture began. The inquisitors would formally inform you that any injury or death that occurred during the session would be entirely your fault. Because it was your own obstinacy and refusal to tell the truth that forced the Holy Office to apply the measure, you literally sign a legal document or have it recorded that you were informed, absolving them of responsibility for your future agony. its peak bureaucratic cruelty. Your body is now just an instrument for extracting a signed document. The physical tools of the trade are methodical, aimed at specific prolonged suffering. We'll get into the specific methods in the next sections, but for now, the Inquisitor begins one last time with the gentle voice of the Monitio Caritativa, "Confess now, son, and save us all this trouble." Your denial is met with a nod to the executioner, and the physical torment begins. Historians still argue whether the verdugo was instructed to be less cruel than his secular counterparts, as some records suggest the Inquisition used torture less frequently than civil courts of the time, applying it in perhaps only 2% of cases. However, for you strapped down and listening to the creaking of the mechanism, the distinction is meaningless. The pain is not a theatrical spectacle. It is a meticulous step-by-step application of force aimed at forcing you to say the one thing that will make it stop: "I confess." You may notice that in this small, dark room, the air is thick, not with blood, but with tension and the smell of sweat and fear. The silence is broken only by the Inquisitor's cool questions, the scratch of the secretary's quill, and soon the sounds of your own suffering. The process is not a flash of agony, but a calculated, drawn-out affair where every second feels like an eternity. The goal is information, or rather the confession they believe contains the true information. You are about to face the first and perhaps the most terrifying method, the simulation of drowning. The Inquisitor gives the signal, and the first of the three classic Spanish Inquisition torture methods begins la toca, or the water cure. This is the simulation of drowning, a method of interrogation that relies entirely on sensory terror and the immediate threat of suffocation, perfectly adhering to their paradoxical rule of no effusion of blood. You are already secured, usually stretched out on a sloping rack or bench, your head lower than your feet. Your hands and feet are bound tightly to the wood. The executioner now approaches with a piece of linen or cloth, the toca, and stuffs it deep into your mouth and throat. This is a crucial historical fact. The toca or cloth was inserted to prevent the water from being spat out, ensuring that the accused would be forced to ingest the water, leading to the sensation of immediate, terrifying drowning. Once the cloth is positioned, the verdugo begins the process of pouring water, usually from a large jug or pitcher, slowly and steadily onto the cloth. The water, often cold, saturates the linen, which swells and presses down on your palate and pharynx. The water trickles into your airways, and the saturated cloth effectively blocks your ability to breathe. The sensation is instant and absolute panic. You feel the water filling your mouth, soaking the linen, and you can't expel it. Your body is convinced you are drowning. You thrash against the ropes, but the bindings are merciless. Your stomach begins to swell grotesquely as the water forces its way down, putting pressure on your diaphragm and lungs. You gag, you choke, and you desperately try to suck air past the sodden fabric, but you can't. The secretary, meanwhile, is listening intently, his quill scratching away. The Inquisitor, standing over you with a calm, deliberate voice, repeats the questions in the middle of your suffocating terror. Will you confess your heresy? Will you name your accomplices? Tell us the truth. Tell us the truth. Here is a quirky tidbit about the water cure. The amount of water used was often measured precisely, usually, by the number of pitchers or jarros. The records might state that you were given 5 jarros of water. This meticulous measurement again highlights the Inquisition's obsession with bureaucratic control, attempting to make even this horrific act seem measured and restrained. For you gagging on the second jarro, the number is irrelevant. The fear is total. Your body goes into survival mode. Your muscles tighten, your eyes bulge, and you experience the crushing, primal fear of suffocation. You might hear your own ragged gurgling, which the secretary records as the accused made sounds of distress and refused to respond. Historians still argue whether the physical pain of La Toca was worse than its psychological terror. While it rarely caused visible lasting injury, the simulation of drowning, the absolute loss of control over one's own breath, is universally accepted as one of the most effective and terrifying forms of interrogation. It leaves no obvious marks, yet it leaves the victim totally broken by fear. You realize that the only thing that will stop the flow of water is the confession they crave. If you scream out a request to confess, the inquisitor will immediately order the process to stop. The tosa will be removed, and you'll be coughing, spitting, and fighting to regain your breath. But the tribunal will demand that you wait. They will give you a moment to recover, and then ask you to confirm your confession out of the immediate duress of the torture. If you confess immediately, they record it. If you refuse, the inquisitor, with a sigh, will simply order the water cure to resume. If the water cure fails to break your obstinacy, the tribunal moves on to the next and potentially far more damaging implement, the stretching. The water cure failed to crack your defiance. You choked, you panicked, you nearly drowned, but you held on to your denial, perhaps gasping out a weak refusal or simply collapsing into silence. The tribunal is disappointed but not deterred. They have a procedure to follow. You are untied from the water bench, still shaking and spitting, and led over to the next instrument, El Potro, the rack. If La Toca was psychological terror, El Potro is pure bone-deep physical agony. This is the machine most people associate with torture, and for good reason. The mainstream historical fact is that the rack El Potro, or escalera, in some Spanish versions was a frame on which the victim was tied and progressively stretched, causing excruciating pain by dislocating joints, particularly in the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees. Imagine being laid down on a wooden frame, slightly raised off the ground. Your wrists and ankles are securely bound by ropes that are attached to rollers at either end of the frame. The inquisitor repeats his question. Will you now speak the truth and save your soul? Your refusal is the signal for the verdugo to begin. The verdugo slowly turns a windlass or a handle. The ropes tighten, and the rollers begin to separate, pulling your body in two opposing directions. The first sensation is a horrible grinding tension. The ropes bite into your flesh. Then the stretching begins. Your muscles, already cold and tense, scream in protest. The joints are the weakest points. You feel a tearing, popping sensation, often starting in the wrists or ankles, as the ligaments are stressed to the breaking point. The inquisitor demands, confess, what have you done, who are your accomplices? The verdugo pauses, waits for your response, then turns the handle again. This rhythmic application and release of tension is a key psychological component. You know the pain will stop if you speak, but you also know the pain's coming back if you remain silent. The next turn, the pain ratchets up to an unbearable level. You hear a sound, a dull, sickening thud, and realize it was the dislocation of your own shoulder. Here's a quirky tidbit. The version of El Potro used by the Spanish Inquisition was sometimes described as a simple ladder or inclined bench, differentiating it from the more elaborate full-sized racks used by other European states. In some variants, ropes were simply wrapped around your limbs and tightened using sticks, garrotes, rather than large rollers, allowing for more localized, intense pressure. Regardless of the specific mechanism, the result was the same: the slow, systematic destruction of your joints while carefully avoiding, in the tribunal's technical view, an actual break that would violate the rule against permanent mutilation. Remember the rule from Section 9, no effusion of blood. This is why the rack was preferred over methods that drew blood. However, the internal damage was catastrophic. Historians still argue whether the inquisitors truly believed they were adhering to the letter of the law when they recorded in the transcripts that the prisoners suffered injuries due to their own wickedness and the force with which they exerted themselves against the ropes. The fact remains that many who survived El Potro were permanently crippled, carrying the agonizing reminder of their trial for the rest of their lives. Your denial is now reduced to a series of ragged, pained screams, but the secretary calm and professional records only the question and your failure to provide a coherent, acceptable answer. You are in a fog of pain, and your mind is starting to give way. The verdugo is ordered to cease. You are left a broken, agonizing mess, your body stretched, your joints ruined. They have failed to get the full confession. There is one last dreadful method left in the official repertoire. Your body is a wreck. The agonizing throbbing from your racked limbs pulses with every breath. But your stubborn denial still echoes in the chamber. The inquisitors have a third officially sanctioned method they may now employ, often considered the most common of the three, la Garrucha, or the strappado. You are hauled or perhaps dragged from the rack. Your wrists are tightly bound behind your back with heavy rope. This specific binding, pulling the hands up and back toward the shoulders, is a key element of the torment. The mainstream historical fact is that La Garrucha involved hoisting the accused high into the air by their bound wrists, often with added weights attached to their ankles, causing immediate and excruciating dislocation of the shoulder joints. You are brought to the pulley mechanism, which is usually affixed to the ceiling. The rope attached to your wrists is threaded through the pulley. The verdugo begins to haul and your body lifts off the floor. The initial pain is searing, concentrated entirely in the shoulders. The weight of your entire body, amplified by any weights, tied to your ankles, pulls your shoulder sockets apart. You feel a grinding, tearing sensation, often followed by a sickening snap as your shoulders pop out of their joints. This is not a slow stretch like the rack. This is a sudden, violent separation of bone and tendon. Once you are suspended near the ceiling, the inquisitor begins the questions again, his voice still that steady, unemotional drone. Will you now confess your sins against the holy faith? You might manage only a ragged, incomprehensible moan. Then comes the specific, terrifying action of the Garrucha. The verdugo is ordered to drop you. Not all the way to the ground, which would be instant death or certainly permanent maiming, but to suddenly let the rope slip a few feet, then abruptly check the fall. Here's a quirky tidbit. The sudden drop and snap stop was known as a caída, or fall, and it multiplied the force on the dislocated shoulders, often causing secondary damage to the spine and ligaments. The sensation of falling, then snapping to a dead stop, sends a shockwave of unimaginable pain through your already destroyed upper body. You hang there, your arms twisted unnaturally above you, your body convulsing. The secretary records every caída, perhaps 5 or 10 drops in a session. Each time, the inquisitor interjects with the repeated demand for a truthful confession. Every second you are suspended is a battle against fainting from the pain. The rules against effusion of blood have been technically obeyed. You are not bleeding externally, but your internal damage is extensive, leaving you with permanent nerve damage and skeletal deformity. You are essentially broken. Historians still argue whether the inquisitors were genuinely worried about the moral implications of the torture methods, or whether their strict adherence to procedure was a form of institutional self-preservation, ensuring that they could justify their actions within the framework of canon law, effectively outsourcing the brutality to the faceless verdugo. You are lowered finally, a limp, ruined sack of flesh, your arms completely useless. The Inquisitor gives you one final opportunity. He points to the scribe and reminds you that your words are being recorded, and that if you confess, you will save your soul. The torture is officially over. You have endured the Toca, the Potro, and the Garrucha. The tribunal has demonstrated its ability to inflict pain and your ability to endure it. Now utterly spent, you are faced with the terrible choice: continue your denial and face the possibility of a continuation of the process on a later date, or offer the confession they so desperately desire. At this point, most people, completely shattered, choose the latter. They choose to stop the pain. You have endured the physical horrors of the Camera de Tormento. Your body is in shock, your joints are ruined, and you are broken spiritually, mentally, and physically. The verdugo has stopped the pain, but the silence now is perhaps even more demanding than the noise of the rack. The Inquisitor and the secretary are waiting. They need your confession. Lying on a stretcher or slumped on a chair, you finally give them the words they want. You confess to the charges you admit to Judaizing, to secretly observing the Sabbath, to encouraging others in the forbidden practices. You name the accomplices you guessed at earlier, or perhaps you name the people you were genuinely trying to protect, now sacrificing them just to end the agony. The confession, secured immediately following the cessation of torture, was considered valid proof of guilt by the Inquisition, even though it was obviously coerced. This is a critical, mainstream historical fact of the process. But the ordeal is not over. The tribunal knows that a confession under duress is questionable. So typically, within 24 hours, you are brought back to the main audience chamber, healed just enough to be lucid, but still in agonizing pain. The Inquisitor now asks you to ratify your confession. He asks if the statements you made yesterday while in the torture chamber were true and voluntarily given. This is the ultimate trap. If you ratify the confession, you are officially, legally, and permanently a heretic. You will be reconciled with the Church, but you face severe penance, the loss of your property, and a lifetime of public shame. However, the agony will end, and you will not be returned to the torture chamber. If you retract your confession, claiming you only spoke those words to stop the pain, the tribunal sees this as a sign of your enduring falsehood, your pertinacia. You have proven that even the fear of God cannot compel you to truth. Your previous session of torture can now be considered invalid because it did not produce a ratified confession. The result: you are considered relapsed not in the spiritual sense yet, but in the procedural sense of withholding the truth, and you will be returned for a continuation of the torture session on another day. This continuation, while technically not a repeat, means more of the rack, the Garrucha, or the water cure. Given your physical state, you know a continuation is likely to kill you. Here's a quirky tidbit. The most learned inquisitors were known to study the psychological effects of different torments. They understood that a person would say anything to stop the pain, which is why they made the ratification phase separate. Some manuals even suggested ways to phrase the ratification to make it sound more credible, such as having the prisoner state that the torture only loosened his tongue so he could finally confess the truth that was in his heart. You, staring into the cold eyes of the Inquisitor, understand the reality. There is no escape. If you insist on innocence now, they will break you further, perhaps fatally. If you confess, you condemn yourself to a living death. Most choose the former. You confirm that yes, the confession was true, and you willingly admit your heresy and beg for reconciliation. Now you become a penitent. The torture stops for good. You are returned to a slightly less isolated cell to await the sentencing, which will happen at the most public ritualized event of the Inquisition, the auto da fe. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma inflicted during the torture and the subsequent fear of being labeled a relapsed heretic, which carried the sentence of death by burning, was actually a more effective tool of social control than the physical pain itself. The system made going back on your coerced confession too deadly to contemplate. You have confessed, and now you must pay the price publicly and profoundly. You have confessed, ratified your confession, and avoided the certain death of a continuation of torture. Now, after weeks or months more of waiting in your cell, this time, a penitential cell, often communal and with an atmosphere of enforced piety, you are prepared for the world to see your repentance. This is the auto da fe, or act of faith. Forget the image of a quick, dark execution. The auto da fe was not primarily an execution, but an elaborate, hours-long public ritual, a solemn piece of street theater designed to showcase the power and mercy of the Holy Office. The mainstream historical fact is that the auto da fe was the public ceremony where the sentences of the Inquisition were read out, functioning as a massive civic spectacle of reconciliation and judgment. Imagine the day. It starts at dawn. The town square is packed. A massive wooden scaffold or stage has been erected, often draped in black. You, the penitent, along with dozens of others, are led in a slow, mournful procession from the prison to the square. The air is thick with anticipation and the hushed murmurs of the immense crowd, which often included royalty nobles and the entire city population. This was an official holiday, a required attendance. The first thing you notice is the garment you are forced to wear, the San Benito, a corruption of sacco bendito, or blessed sack. This is a heavy, coarse wool tunic worn over your clothes. It is adorned with symbols indicating your crime and your sentence. If you are reconciled, like you are, your San Benito might be yellow with a red St. Andrew's cross. For those condemned to death, it features flames and pictures of demons, signifying their consignment to the secular arm. Here's a quirky tidbit. The San Benito was not a temporary shame. After the ceremony, it was often hung permanently in your parish church, bearing your name and crime. Even after your death, the public display of your San Benito ensured that the shame of heresy clung to your family for generations. You were literally clothing your descendants in infamy, preventing them from holding public office or entering certain guilds because of the stain on your bloodline. The ceremony is a marathon of sermons, prayers, and oaths. For hours you stand on the scaffold, the sun beating down, listening to a lengthy sermon, praising the Inquisition and detailing the evils of heresy. The most dramatic part is the reading of the sentences. Your name is called, your supposed crimes, which you confess to under torture, are read aloud, and your sentence is announced. Your sentence as a reconciled penitent will likely include confiscation of your remaining property. You pay the bill, remember? A penance of scourging public whipping, often administered immediately after the auto da fe, a lengthy term of imprisonment or galley servitude, and the obligation to wear the San Benito in public for a prescribed number of years or even for life. You must now become a walking billboard for the Inquisition's justice. Historians still argue whether the auto da fe was meant more as a religious act of purification for the community or as a powerful, politically motivated display of the monarchy's absolute power over the spiritual lives of its subjects. Whatever the intent, the effect on you is total humiliation and permanent social death. The psychological theater is overwhelming. But among the crowd and on the scaffold are others who did not confess or who, worse, confessed under the Edict of Grace but then relapsed. These individuals are spared the lengthy penance but face the final, most terrible sentence. You watch as they too are stripped of their dignity before being handed over for the ultimate judgment. The auto da fe reaches its dreadful climax. You stand on the scaffold, publicly shamed and reconciled to a life of penance. Your fate, though harsh, is sealed. But now your attention is drawn to those standing nearby who have been condemned to a far worse fate. These are the impenitent, those who refuse to confess even after torture, or the truly terrifying category, the relapsos, those who confessed freely under the Edict of Grace or initially under torture, but then retracted their confession during the ratification phase, or worst of all, those who had been reconciled once before and were caught committing the offense again. For these souls, the Inquisitor pronounces the final, chilling verdict: they are to be relaxed to the secular arm. This phrase is the final bureaucratic masterpiece of the Inquisition. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Inquisition itself never executed anyone. Instead, it relaxed the condemned to the civil secular authorities, thereby maintaining the institutional fiction that the Holy Office was solely concerned with the salvation of the soul and was mercifully washing its hands of the execution. You watch as the condemned are formally handed over to the city officials who are waiting just off the scaffold. At this moment, the Inquisitor makes one final bizarre plea for their lives, asking the secular authorities to be lenient and spare the life of the condemned. This request was a pure legal formality, a final, quirky tidbit of the twisted process, as the civil authorities were legally bound by the terms of the agreement with the Inquisition to execute all those who were relaxed. It was a theatrical exercise in moral abdication. The condemned are marched away from the main square to the quemadero, the burning place which was typically just outside the city walls. They are still wearing the San Benito and the Coroza, a tall, conical hat, both painted with images of flames and devils to signify their damnation. The final execution method was almost universally burning at the stake. The degree of mercy they received depended on their last-minute actions. If on the way to the pyre or while tied to the stake, the impenitent suddenly broke down and made a heartfelt confession of faith, they were granted the mercy of the garrote strangulation before the flames were lit. This meant they were already dead when the fire consumed them, which was considered an act of great charity. However, if they maintained their denial, or if their last-minute confession was deemed insincere, they were burned alive. Historians still argue whether the spectacle of the burning was intended primarily as a terrifying deterrent for the public, or as a genuine theological necessity, fire being the traditional biblical agent of purification. For you, the reconciled penitent, watching the smoke rise from the quemadero, confirms the horror of the path you barely avoided. You have been saved, but your salvation has come at the cost of your freedom, your wealth, and your entire reputation. You will now begin your penance, years of wearing the humiliating San Benito imprisonment and the permanent stigma of being a heretic. The auto da fe concludes. The crowds disperse, the scaffolds are dismantled, but the fear remains ingrained in the city's memory and permanently affixed to your identity. The system worked, it achieved a confession, it secured a conviction, and it terrified the populace into religious conformity. You, the former subject, are now the living proof of the absolute chilling efficiency of the Holy Office. The final images of the day of the crowds leaving, and the lingering scent of smoke begin to soften. As the sounds of the Spanish city fade away, allow yourself to breathe out the tension of that long, agonizing journey. You are no longer standing in the town square, watching the justice of the 15th century unfold. You are here safe in your room, centuries removed from the intricate, slow-moving terror of the tribunal. We've walked through the bureaucratic steps, the whispers that became evidence, the cold logic of the Monitio Caritativa, and the controlled violence of the torture chamber, all the way to the public shame of the San Benito. It's a story of how a methodical, rule-bound system can generate immense human suffering not through sudden acts of madness, but through slow, calculated, institutional control. Let the details of the Toca and the rack, the anonymous accusers, and the permanent stain of the San Benito simply drift away, now melting into the soft hum of the evening. It's time to let your muscles relax, your mind empty, and your eyelids grow heavy. The past is quiet, and the present is still. You are secure. There is no knock at the door. There is only the gentle, rhythmic sound of your own quiet breathing. Just the slow inhale and the slow exhale. Thank you for joining me on this boring piece of history tonight. May your dreams be nothing but peaceful, gentle, and utterly silent. Sweet dreams.